The trauma bay doors burst open, and blood hit the tile floor before the gurney even stopped moving. A soldier, torn apart by shrapnel, screamed out in agony as the overhead monitors screamed with him, and in that chaos, nobody noticed the quiet new nurse standing at the edge of the room, waiting for her chance to prove she belonged. What happened in the next 60 seconds would humiliate a proud surgeon, silence an entire hospital, and reveal a secret that would leave everyone speechless. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in people who prove themselves through action instead of words, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this video with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Her name was Grace Whitfield, and she had walked into St. Mercy General Hospital in Charleston, South Carolina, on a gray Monday morning carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a quiet, steady calm that most people mistook for shyness. She was 32 years old, with sun-weathered hands and eyes that had seen far more than her soft-spoken voice let on. To the staff at St. Mercy, she was simply the new nurse, fresh transfer, no big deal. Nobody bothered to read her full file. Nobody noticed the 8-year gap in her civilian resume, the gap where the government redacted everything except 2 words: active duty. Dr. Marcus Rain ran Trauma Bay 2 like his personal kingdom. He was brilliant, no one denied that, but he wore his brilliance like armor, and underneath it was a man who needed to feel superior to survive his own insecurities. He had trained at the finest schools, published papers, saved lives on operating tables slick with blood, and somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that arrogance was the same thing as confidence. When Grace was assigned to his unit, he barely looked up from his chart. "New nurse," he muttered to his resident, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "Let's see how long this one lasts before she faints at the sight of a compound fracture." Grace said nothing. She simply nodded, checked her badge, and got to work restocking gauze in the supply closet, her hands moving with a precision that nobody paused to notice. For the first 2 weeks, Marcus made it his personal mission to needle her. He corrected her in front of patients even when she was right. He questioned her competence during rounds, rolling his eyes when she suggested a different approach to wound irrigation. He called her sweetheart in front of the residents, a small cruelty dressed up as charm, and every single time, Grace absorbed it without flinching, without arguing, without giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. The other nurses whispered about it in the break room. "Someone should tell her to stand up for herself," one of them said. But standing up for herself was never Grace's problem. She had simply learned, in places far darker than this hospital, that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one that matters when lives are on the line. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. A call came in from the county's Veterans Affairs Transport Unit. A former Army Ranger named Thomas Kessler had collapsed during a training exercise for wounded veterans, a deep laceration across his thigh reopening an old combat injury, blood loss severe, vitals dropping fast. The ambulance bay doors slammed open and the gurney rolled in surrounded by panicked paramedics, and for a moment, the entire trauma team froze. The wound was catastrophic, femoral artery dangerously close, and Thomas was fading in and out of consciousness, whispering his wife's name. Marcus, sweat already beading on his forehead, barked orders that came out jumbled, his hands shaking as he reached for the wrong instrument tray. In that split second of hesitation, something in Grace shifted. She stepped forward without being asked, her voice suddenly different, sharp and clear and unshakably calm, the voice of someone who had commanded chaos before. "Pressure here, now," she said, guiding a trembling intern's hands to the exact point above the wound. Not out of disrespect, but because there was no time left for politeness. Marcus, embarrassed and defensive, snapped at her in front of the entire room. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded, stepping between her and the patient. "This isn't your call to make. If you can't handle real trauma, get out of my bay." The room went silent except for the frantic beeping of Thomas Kessler's failing heart monitor. Grace looked at him, not with anger, but with the tired patience of someone who had heard this exact tone of voice from men in far more dangerous places than a hospital hallway. "Fine," she said quietly. "You handle it your way. I'll bandage him your way, if that's what proves something to you." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a challenge born of ego. It was a decision, made in less time than it takes to breathe, because a man's life was draining onto the floor and someone needed to act. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grace Whitfield had spent 6 years as a combat surgeon attached to a naval special warfare unit, deployed in places whose names never made the news, patching together broken bodies in the back of moving vehicles under gunfire, with no operating room, no backup team, and no second chances if her hands failed. She had held soldiers' lives together with nothing but pressure, thread, and sheer will more times than she could count. Bandaging a leg wound in a fully equipped American trauma bay, with proper lighting and a full surgical team standing by, was, to her, almost peaceful by comparison. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else entirely, someone trained beyond anything this hospital had ever witnessed. She packed the wound with a controlled, ruthless efficiency, applying pressure with a precision that stopped the bleeding within moments, calling out vitals and instructions to the stunned team around her in short, clipped commands that left no room for doubt. Marcus stood frozen, his earlier mockery drying up in his throat as he watched a woman he had dismissed as beneath him single-handedly stabilize a patient who, moments earlier, had been slipping away. Thomas Kessler's eyes fluttered open. Weak, but alive. He looked up at Grace, and something in his gaze changed, a flicker of recognition passing between two people who had both worn a uniform and understood a kind of sacrifice that civilians rarely grasp. "Doc," he whispered, voice trembling, "is that you? I heard about a battlefield surgeon they called Lieutenant Whitfield. Saved my brother's unit in Kandahar." The room went still. Marcus's face drained of color as the pieces clicked into place, the redacted file, the quiet confidence, the steady hands that never once shook even under pressure that had made him crumble. He had spent 2 weeks mocking a decorated military surgeon, a woman who had saved more lives on foreign soil than he likely would in his entire career, simply because she hadn't announced herself, because she hadn't needed to. In the days that followed, word spread through St. Mercy like wildfire. The staff who once whispered about the quiet new nurse now spoke her name with something close to reverence. Marcus, humbled in a way he had never experienced, found her alone in the break room a week later. He didn't offer excuses. He simply said he was sorry, that he had let his own fear of looking weak turn him into someone he didn't recognize, and that watching her work had reminded him why he became a doctor in the first place. Grace, true to the quiet strength that defined her, forgave him without hesitation. She wasn't there to prove anyone wrong. She was there to save lives, the same reason she always had been. Thomas Kessler recovered fully, and months later, at a small ceremony held in the hospital courtyard, he stood on his own 2 feet and thanked the woman who had refused to let arrogance or ego stand between her and a life worth saving. Marcus stood in the crowd that day too, no longer the man who needed to be the smartest person in the room, but a doctor who had finally learned that true strength doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up, quietly, and does the work. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that kindness and quiet strength can outshine arrogance every single time, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And before we go, I want to ask you something simple. If you believe that everyone deserves a chance to be truly seen for who they are, drop the words, "well deserved," in the comments below, so we know this story reached you. Grace Whitfield never wore her medals to work. She never needed to. Because real heroes, the ones who matter most, are rarely the ones shouting the loudest in the room. They are the steady hands quietly holding everything together when everyone else has already given up.